Hello everyone, good morning. Welcome everyone to PMI North India Learning Bytes series of webinar. This program entitles you for one video. Video information will be shown towards the end of the webinar. Topic for today's webinar is managing globally distributed open source projects. Webinar is presented by Mr. Maneesh Sharma. Maneesh Sharma is the country manager for GitHub in India, where he leads the company's growth and operations. With over 22 years of experience under his belt, he is passionate about technology innovations and software products from India. Prior to joining GitHub, he was responsible for driving Adobe's strategy, business operations, partner ecosystem in India. He has also run the platform business at SAP India as the head of products and solution, and has involved with developer community during his stint with Sun Microsystems. An avid reader in 2005, Manish founded India's first online book library, bookme.com, to keep the passion of reading books alive in people from all walks of life. Manish holds an MBA degree from IIM Bangalore and a BE in Electronics and Communication from National Institute of Technology, Surat. Manish lives in Delhi and in his spare time he enjoys learning to play his guitar collection and playing retro video games. Thank you, Manish, for taking out your precious time and sharing your valuable thoughts with us.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. Really humbling. Pleasure to be here. Saturday morning. Thank you for taking the time out. It's an interesting topic. When PMI reached out for this session, I was literally scratching my head. How do I, construct a session on GitHub to talk to all of you who are, real practitioners of project management? But I made an attempt. Thank you for spending the time. Let me talk you through, what we're doing on DevOps, open source, and how do distributed teams globally leverage GitHub to create software projects. I'll keep this short and then open up to questions that you might have. Does that sound okay, Rajesh?
Thank you so much, sir.
Perfect. Great. So let's just dive in. So let me start off with the obvious. I think what we are seeing across the landscape and spectrum of all industries is digital disruption. I know it's been accelerated over the last few months because of COVID, but this is a phenomena that's been going on for a very long time. Traditional industries have been disrupted by digital. And one thing that you see, which is common in all of these, is their roots in technology and software. So new age companies are actually using software to disrupt traditional industries, and they're actually leading with customer experience. Right? The reason all of us on this call, what we're doing on this remote session, or the apps that we're interacting with, the reason we use it so often is because of the experience it delivers to us. And that is really, really an iterative process if you think about it. To get customer experience right for a large audience, there are lots of things that are involved in making that product. And this is, lots of research has been done. And the reason these new leaders are way ahead of the pack is because they're really driving the customer experience. You and I are the customers of these new companies, and it is phenomenal, right? The difference in how they are performing versus the laggards is staggering. Whether you take a look at from a financial perspective or even an engagement with customers, brand loyalty, increased usage. So this customer experience is really, really becoming very important in the digital age. But it's not easy. If you think about, customer experience, I'm sure all of you wake up in the morning and you will see on your phone that your apps have been updated, right? Maybe you're using Zomato or you're using Swiggy, that there is actually an update that is happening to your applications almost on a daily basis. And that's what's really differentiating these digital disruptors as well. They're actually shipping projects, and these are software projects, way faster than traditional industries. And if you think about it, the reason for this is because when you look at customer experience, it's always an iterative process, right? There is A/B testing. You have to see what users are really using. Is it easy to use? And then you quickly iterate and come up with the next solution to make the experience better for your customers, right? And mobile, I don't have to talk much about it, but mobile has really disrupted this whole consumption pattern where you really need to iterate quickly to stay connected with your consumers. And this is across industries, right? It doesn't even have to be the B2C apps that you and I use every day. It's even in businesses. When you're looking at B2B, all software products and projects, if they are not user-friendly, if they're not serving the purpose quickly, then they're really not going to be used anywhere. And this has put a lot of constraints on software projects itself. If you remember a couple of decades back, a project used to be 9 months or a 1-year project, where right from starting off with the plan for the project to delivery, it used to be a full year. But what we're seeing now is releases happening almost every day. So the really innovative companies are actually iterating and releasing updates. And these are not patches, these are updates to their projects almost every day. So when you think about it from a context of project management, right, this is truly a very disruptive model on how software is being developed. And software engineering has always been a project, right? Way back in, I'm sure all of you would have studied in college or school when we talked about the software engineering. It was always about how do you manage software projects. And in today's time, it is actually getting so disruptive and so fast in coming up with new solutions that the whole paradigm of software project management is actually going through an overhaul itself. It has happened over the last couple of years, but it is really accelerating. So what I thought I will share with you is our perspectives of what's going on in the industry and how GitHub as a platform enables that. And I'll talk about GitHub towards the end. So let me start off with the most basic one. I'm sure you've heard about the SDLC, the software development lifecycle. The most common one has always been the waterfall model, where it all starts with requirement analysis, where business analysts would work with the end customer on gathering what they need to do or what they want, documenting those requirements, sharing it with the next team, which would then sort of design the solution or the product that needs to be created, hand it off to software engineering or development, which then goes into testing. It then gets deployed, and then it runs into the maintenance phase where continuous bug fixes or upgrades happens through this. And I'm sure you can relate this back to any project management tool or a manufacturing tool where there are different iterative processes of doing development. The reason we have the CD on the left is, whenever you look at this CD and whenever you look at America Online, you always think, oh, this is so last century, right? Software development lifecycle is also looked at today as last century because it really doesn't help achieve the points I just talked through in the previous slides. The way it happens is it's actually silos in the SDLC lifecycle. You have those red lines that you see are actually what I call as walls between teams. So your business analysts sit on one side of the wall, who hands over these requirements to one set, which is the developer. They will develop something. They will hand it over to the build team, which is bringing all the components of the project together, putting it into a package, and then handing it over to the testing team who would test it, and then hand it over to ops. So in the software world, the ops team is basically the one that takes care of the deployment. Because once you have a software product, it needs to be deployed somewhere and it needs to be managed. So this is where all the data centers, the operating systems, the storage systems, the networks, everything comes in and they have to manage it. And this whole cycle in the SDLC world is actually sequential, if not linear. And that really what it takes away is the whole feedback mechanism. And I'm sure all of you who are practitioners would know that in managing a project, it's very, very important to have feedback mechanisms in place. And in today's world, if you follow this model, you will really not be able to achieve, forget about a month, but even, a 6-month project to be delivered to a customer and then use. And by the time you keep doing this, your competition would have literally taken away the market. What's been going on over the last few years is a move towards Agile. And Agile is common across all project streams. I'm sure you know of that, right? It's evolved through lots of models. You can call it in some forms of Scrum, in some forms of Kanban, but there are lots of project management techniques which have sort of been adapted into the software development lifecycle, where from a linear and sequential model of SDLC, it's sort of like a feedback loop, which is tightly integrated, where you have feedback going in from the business requirement gathering team to the testing team to the design team. So it's more iterative. And by doing so, you're actually able to create software and ship software a lot faster. Right? So what it's actually done is it's broken down a couple of walls. So between the customer and the project team, the one that is really building it, it has actually made software development a lot more quicker. But there is still one big wall that still remains, which is the operations team. So when you really think about a project in the software world, it's very different from think of it like an auto plant. And so when you're manufacturing a car, this whole team on the left before this wall is perfect, right? Because you can really optimize the whole plant operations and life cycle to rapidly create the product that you want. And then once it's shipped to a customer, right, it's fine. You can maintain the car from a very different perspective. But when you look at software, the rules of the game change, right? So if you've created, let's say, an app, right? For lack of any other better example, let's take a video streaming app for what TikTok is doing and everybody is creating it. It's not enough to just create the perfect app. Once you deploy it, your consumers need to use it. It needs to be effective. It needs to scale, right? So it's not as if after 100,000 users, suddenly the application doesn't scale. So these are the things that is the responsibility mostly of the operations team. Now, in the software and technology world, the variables that are there in a deployment are many. So having a controlled environment for running your projects also becomes, paramount. And that is what really constrains the ops team from making too many changes. So it's actually, this is the kind of wall that has, over the last few years been built between project/dev teams and operations. The project team actually wants to iterate quickly, release new patches, release new features, release new customer experiences. But at the same time, operations want stability. The minute you introduce a new variable from your code perspective, some other thing might not work. Right, so it's a very interesting partnership that exists between the dev team and operations to really make your project effective. And when you're thinking about whether it is open source or any other software project from a global scale perspective, right, this integration between dev and ops is super important, right, because they cannot be silos anymore. So this is effectively what we look at from a software project perspective. The whole life cycle from the customer to deployment, which is the operations, are all integrated and they have a very tight feedback loop so that you're able to iterate quickly. So what's really happening is, I love how, this looks at as a DevOps infinity model, because that's truly what it is. When you're doing a project in software engineering, you are continuously, building, planning, integrating, deploying, delivering, and having the feedback mechanism. And this tight integration requires a lot of collaboration across teams. I'm sure when you've read all the project management case studies, whether it is at Toyota or many others, you would have realized that it was not only about the process, it was also about the communication, the feedback loop, and the integration between teams that really accelerated the whole project. And that's what DevOps also seeks to achieve. The whole project concept of DevOps makes sure that the deployment and the development are tightly integrated. So this is how it's moving. Instead of doing one monolith development and deployment, you're actually doing it by module, right? So you have right from your dev team to your deployment team incrementally deploying solutions, integrating them, and testing them at scale. This allows you to have a real feedback loop, as I was talking about, between these two teams, so that you're able to iterate very, very quickly. So I thought I will set this context of, where does DevOps and project management come in? In fact, DevOps actually inherits all of its philosophies from project management, from Scrum, from Kanban, and a lot of other methodologies. I would really like the participants to look at a book called The Phoenix Project. It's a very cult book from a software engineering and software project management perspective. It's a novel. It's really not, a plain non-fiction management book, but it's actually written in a way of a novel. I will really, implore you to read it, and you'll get a very good view of, what I just talked about. But again, DevOps alone is not enough, and that's a very powerful statement. Yes, DevOps as a methodology for project management is being adapted by software projects, software engineering, software product development teams across the globe. But there is one very important thing that is also fundamental to software projects these days, and that actually is open source. So open source has been around for a very long time now. There have been many conversations, many usages, but I can tell you that open source has won all the battles as we stand today. If you take any software project today, 80 to 90% of those projects, of those codes would actually be open source code. So no project today starts off from scratch. So whether it is, you looking at starting off an authentication module or a logging module, you will actually go into the open source community, pick up a piece of software code and start using it. And I can tell you, you can pick up any application today, any app that you use, any software that you interact, it would have software components embedded in it today. And this is a very, very large part of software in the world. In fact, I like to think of open source as dark matter. It's everywhere. You don't see it, but it is literally everywhere. And this is where it becomes very important to support and look at how we can nurture the culture of open source software development, because this has evolved over a large period of time, and managing an open source project is not easy. All that I talked about till now is very structured and easy to do when you think about an organization, whether it is in the organization that you're working at or in your customers. Right? There's always a structure. There's always a predefined team with roles, responsibilities. So it's fairly easy to manage. But when you think about open source, this is a fluid network of people across the globe who come together for a specific purpose, build something and contribute to it and share it with the world. And that requires a very different mindset, that requires a very different tools and technologies to enable what I just talked about from a DevOps perspective. given that everybody is distributed, they could be anywhere. And you also don't have this team permanent. People will come, people will go. How do you make sure that the project sustains and it is a successful project as well? So that's one of the most important problems that even when we started off as GitHub many years ago, we looked at how do we enable distributed software development amongst the community to accelerate software development as a whole. So as of today, I know many of you might not be software coders, but import is a way of including a software library in your project. And this is done by almost every software developer today. When they start off, they will import some library. What they're actually doing is they're actually importing hundreds of different collaborators from across the globe into their project. Right? So these are people who would have worked on software projects and built these libraries. So while it's only been these 3 lines that you see on the left that a software developer has coded, but by writing these 3 lines, they've actually included hundreds of people into their project. Right? And that is a phenomenal thing. Whether you are building software in the open source world, or even if you're building software within an organization by consuming this open source software. So what we're seeing in the world today is actually an interconnected community. And so when you think about open source, it's actually an interconnected community of developers, of practitioners, of contributors across the globe who actually come together to work on projects. But it's not easy. Right? So when you look at an open source project, it's a reverse pyramid model. You will have millions of users. So users are the one who would take an open source piece of code or open source project and use it. That distills down to a few contributors. Contributors are the ones who might, come and contribute by reporting a bug. They might contribute by writing a help document, or they might contribute by just fixing a bug. And then it further distills down to maintainers. The difference between a contributor and a maintainer is contributor might be transient, right? They'll come and go. Maintainers are really who are involved in the project. They own it. They have that sense of responsibility of making sure that the project progresses. And these different sets of users are also different actors within the software development lifecycle that I showed to you earlier, right? So business analysts to users to testers to deployment. That role is actually mixed between the contributors and maintainers, right? So you really need a very agile, a very flexible and open platform to be able to bring all of this together and make a project work. I hope I'm not going too fast. Everything is fine.
You're going great. Thank you.
Cool. So what really makes an open source community or a project healthy? Right? There are many open source projects that are out there. Some thrive, some don't. So what really makes something healthy and thrive is obviously having a very active maintainer and a contributor ecosystem. Right? So the more users who are coming into your project and contributing, the more it'll thrive, the more rich it will become. And they take care of that continuous improvement of customer feedback, customer experience, and requirements that the end user might have. I won't talk about the license because it's pretty simple from an open source perspective. But at the same time, since you have such a diverse set of people coming in and going out as well, you need to define standard engineering practices, right? So you cannot have a chaotic project just because everybody is distributed in across the world and don't know each other. They cannot be doing something on their own. Right? It needs to be standardized. It needs to be documented. There also needs to be a lot of best practices, especially from a security perspective. When you're building software, it becomes very important to take a look at security very, very seriously. And in the open source world, it's more the fact that it is open. It also increases the chances of somebody making changes to something that might break the whole security framework. So how do you create those security best practices? But most importantly is communication, right? One of the main thing of the agile and the DevOps lifecycle that I talked about earlier was the continuous feedback mechanism, which is the communication process. How do team members, how do project owners, how do maintainers, contributors keep communicating with each other on what the requirement is, who's doing what, what's happening next, how do you prioritize? And at the same time, it's a very democratic way of doing things, right? It's not an authoritative way of this is the project, this is the specs, this is how we will develop it. The whole thing in the open source community is it's a very healthy two-way communication. So you might request for a feature to be developed, but there will be 100 people from across the globe who would actually debate that feature, whether you really need it or not. And that healthy debate actually makes sure you're really building a rock solid project or a product in the open source community. So when you look at all of this, it becomes very important to put together a platform to enable this whole DevOps as a practice and open source as a culture. GitHub has actually evolved over the last 12 to 13 years on the base of building this platform that enables all those points that I talked about, right? How do you get distributed teams to come together to plan, code, build, test, release, deploy, operate, monitor, and then go back again and do it again and again? And this has attracted so many open source projects. This has attracted so many enterprises, because enterprises also realize that they also want to do, pick up these best practices from the open source community and build software in the same way, right? Which is more collaborative. It talks more about reuse. So let me quickly talk about, how does the open source community actually work on projects and how do they do it? The first and foremost is, when you create a project on GitHub, documentation. It's always important, but defining what are the guidelines of the project becomes very important. So when you go onto GitHub and look at any project, whether it is Apache, I'll talk about a few technology project, and I'm sure you'll look it up. Apache, TensorFlow, or Kubernetes, the maintainer or somebody who started on the project would actually document what this project is about, how they are looking at contributions, how should somebody contribute, what are the guidelines, what should somebody do, what should not somebody do. So this is, something like a project manifesto, right? So whoever comes onto the project for the first time will actually go through this. And there are millions and millions of such projects on GitHub. And by documenting your project this way, you're actually inviting like-minded people, you're inviting people who share the same talent or share the same experience of building something like this onto your project. So this becomes the starting point of any project. Make sure you go onto GitHub and take a look at some projects which you find interesting. Right. The second important thing is, okay, so you've got the project in place, you've put the code there, but then how do you start collaboration? Right? How do you get people to start working on the project? And that's where issues and pull requests come in. Think of issues as work items. So somebody who has started a project from, let's say, Mumbai, has posted the project onto GitHub, and he's put all the code that he's developed onto GitHub. There might be a developer in, let's say, Asansol, right? She might come and look at the project and see that she wants to contribute to this. So she will raise an issue and say, hey, I'm going to be working on this with you, but why don't we look at developing feature XYZ? So that's how the conversation starts on a feature work in progress kind of a requirement set that starts building up. And again, since this is open, anybody can come and put in a request. So by doing this, what happens is you're actually controlling the flow of code into your project. So it's not as if anybody can come in and make changes to the code. No, it's a controlled process by the project owner or the maintainer. The issues are sort of like the work streams that get started for collaboration. Again, on these issues is where you will sort of start discussing features and other stuff. So you can sort of relate this to the requirement gathering phase, or you can relate this to the business analysis phase, where you are sort of documenting what is required for a certain feature, and it gets iterated, right? And the beauty is these issues are sort of like documents which are available forever. So who approved what? So until somebody approves a certain feature, it will not go into the main project. So you have the documentation, you have the audit control, all of these things available within an issue for it to be referenced at any point in time. To make things standard, you can actually create templates. So, a random developer from Asansol cannot just, start writing a spec or writing a bug requirement just like that. There will be standard templates that they can use to fill in, right? So this actually helps an open source project maintainer standardize a lot of things. Because for a typical maintainer, there will be thousands and thousands of people working on the project. There will be hundreds of them coming in and going out, as I said. So you really need to standardize a lot of things. Excuse me. And these issue templates is what really helps these open source projects on GitHub sort of make it easier for people also to contribute. The other thing that the platform also does is you get to label them. If you pick up any typical project, they will have thousands of issues open. But how do you prioritize, right? Just like on your Kanban board, you need to prioritize different work streams and work items, right? You can actually take these labels to sort of point out what your specific request or your specific work stream that you've opened on an open source project relates to. And that actually helps one of the maintainers who's responsible for sort of prioritizing understand what goes where. So labels are super important in the whole project development lifecycle. And these labels then get applied to these issues. And so if you see here as an example, add an HTML proof or test. Right? So this is a work stream, and then you can actually put labels. So by putting a label like skills needed review or testing, you're actually inviting somebody from the community who has skills in review and testing to contribute to this work item. So this is one of the ways of soliciting developers to contribute. So apart from that example of that Asansol developer, if there's somebody else who stumbles onto this issue from Delhi and sees, hey, I have these skills, I can actually contribute to this work stream. So this is how you invite, not only invite developers to work on specific work items, but the labels also help you categorize. So this is a visualization I picked up. This is a real life project which I picked up in the morning today, which is TensorFlow, one of the most popular open source project that Google is driving. As you can see, it's a Kanban kind of a board that's been created. Issues have been categorized into one stream which requires assigning a reviewer. Another, the reviewer has requested changes. Third is approved. Merge is when all of the changes in the work stream that has been worked upon has been approved and they get merged into the main project. So code that has been created or changed then gets merged into the main project. And then obviously close and rejectors are the ones, yes, they were worked on, but nothing happened, so they closed it. So this is sort of how anybody can look at what is happening in the project when they go onto GitHub, onto an open source project, who's working on what is delayed. If there's something that I can contribute in, I can straight away jump into the issue and start contributing. Again, the beauty as well as the challenge is it's always a community thing. It's voluntary. So all of these tools actually help an open source developer manage their open source project on GitHub. And that's actually what's led GitHub to be what GitHub is today. So GitHub is an online platform, which today is the largest developer platform, which enables anybody to share code, work on projects collaboratively online. So there are more than 50 million developers. There are more than 100 million private as well as public projects that are running on GitHub. And you literally have thousands and thousands of open source projects on GitHub. Some of the ones which are mentioned here, the more popular one that people will relate to, like Kubernetes, Docker, Apache, Ansible, and many other. But they're also used by large private organizations as well. Because as I was talking to you earlier, open source is also an important part of projects within enterprises. So all of the disruptive digital companies are definitely thinking open source first when they start off their project. And it has also been embraced very nicely by large enterprises too. Because the way I see it, every company on earth is becoming a software company. So all of these practices, all of these methodologies that I talked about becomes very, very important in literally every company that is out there. Whether you're a bank, whether you're a manufacturing entity, whether you're media, you're actually becoming a software company. So these practices become very important. And what GitHub actually provides to the community is a large DevOps ecosystem. So the whole process that I talked to you about, plan, build, code, test, deploy, monitor, you have different tools for doing each part of this cycle on a software project, even in open source. So there are lots of third-party tools that have been created to make each part of that life cycle more effective, more useful for the developer. And that's where the integration of a lot of these third-party come in. So that was a quick talk I wanted to do, just to share with you what we're doing on the open source communities and how it relates back into project management and software development. I would love to open this up to for questions that anybody would have.
Thank you, Ashish. This was great sharing. We do have a few questions from our users. A lot of questions.
Oh, great.
So first one that I will take is from Mr. Shobit Agrawal. Is it safe to use open source project applications? What about security, as it may contain malicious code? Any authority which guarantees that these are safe and without any bugs or viruses?
That's a very good question, Shobit. So this is one of the first thing that pops into everybody's mind when they think about open source. You're absolutely right. So there are two statements here. One, I can tell you that almost every software project in the world is already using open source, right? And the second is all of this open source is living on GitHub. Now, what that has led us to do as GitHub for the community, we take a very strong responsibility in making sure that all of this software is secure. So over the last 18 to 24 months, we've actually put together a lot of things that help the community. It's about 2-3 months ago, we released a lot of features on the platform where any open source project actually gets scanned for any security issues or even for tokens or dependencies that actually make it less secure. So that's one thing that we've done. Second thing is we've also constituted a sort of like a security council with a lot of leading organizations across the world, like Google, Microsoft, Uber, and many other, who have come together to make open source more secure. So we actually take it as a very strong responsibility on our side, since we have access to so much of open source code on GitHub, to make it more secure for our users. So you can actually go online to GitHub and just look at security. You will find a lot of tools that go through open source code and point out what could be the potential issues. One of the website, I'll just put it on the chat. Anybody can point their open project to this tool of GitHub, and they will scan the code and tell you what are the security issues. So by doing a lot of these things and making it free and available to the open source community, we're making sure that security is embedded into your development lifecycle. So we're actually saying that DevOps is now DevSecOps. So security is part of the entire lifecycle of software development.
Thank you, Ashish. Guys, before I take the next question, the PD information for this webinar is up screen, and you may please take a capture of this and note down as it seems fit. The next question that I have is from Amrit Lal. Sir, how people will generate revenue from open source with random business?
That's also a very interesting question, Amrit. So I think if you look at it, the models of monetizing open source, there are many. It has also evolved over a period of time. There are individuals and organizations that monetize helping customers adopt and deploy open source. So that's one model. But I think for your specific question, it's about how does a developer who's contributing to open source get compensated, right? So that's a very important topic, because if I'm an open source developer contributing to a project, that project might be used by the leading auto manufacturer or a leading a rocket manufacturer for creating something commercial. So how do I get compensated for it? One of the things that GitHub launched last year is what we call GitHub Sponsors. GitHub Sponsors enables organizations as well as individuals to sponsor, quote unquote, individuals who are working on open source projects. So this is a way of making sure two things happen. One, you are supporting the open source community. Second, you're actually making sure that the open source project that you're interested in or the ones that you're using in your organization is supported. It's because there are many open source projects that started off around for a while and then died out because nobody was working on them. But the problem was there were organizations who were using that piece of code suddenly were left with something that nobody was working on. So by having a sponsor model available, we're making sure that people in the community are actually making money. And if you just go online and take a look, there are many developers who've started posting online how they're making a large sum of money just by working on open source project because of the GitHub sponsor piece. There are a lot of these interesting programs that we will be soon launching in India as well to support the open source community.
Thank you, Maneesh. Another question from Amrit is how to connect the developer on a project.
How to connect the developer on the project? Is that the question?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So there are multiple ways of doing this. If you are, let's say, an open source maintainer, right, your project, one way is that you are publicizing it, right? You're sharing details on your different media channels, social channels, to get contributors and maintainers to come and support you. That's one. Second is GitHub itself has a very powerful search feature. So you can actually search for projects depending on what your interest is. So let's say your project is focused on developing machine learning modules, right? If there's a developer somewhere in, let's say, Colombo, who also has the same interest, they can actually discover your project and start contributing. So when you go onto GitHub and you look at a specific project, you will see that there are two buttons. One is called Watch and Stars, right? So the more people star, the more popular it becomes, and it shows up in results for people to come and contribute. So these are ways of doing it. The other thing that we've just released is something like a README for individuals as well, so that what projects you're working on, what your interests are, also get published. So not only are you discovering, but you can get discovered as well. So that same Colombo developer might have put up his or her README talking about the machine learning stuff that they worked on, what they're interested in, and you might stumble on their profile and you find that interesting and you invite them to your project. So the GitHub platform actually helps facilitate all of this collaboration in software development.
Thank you, Manish. For Shobit and everyone, the recording for this will be available on PMI North India Chapter's YouTube channel, and you can also look here for the past recording as well. We have another one from Amrit Lal. Is it possible to implement open source methodology in automobile projects?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So there was a recent statistics last year, by the way, that the automobile industry actually hired more software engineers than mechanical engineers, right? And the fact that there's so much software going into a car, a lot of the software is open source. If you go online, you'll actually find a lot of open source communities and projects dedicated to autonomous cars and the whole IoT related to cars. So software is already part of what's happening in the car. But to your specific question on the open source methodology in the automobile industry too, if you think about it, a lot of the templates on how a car body is made, how a chassis is made, all of these are documented stuff that is commonly available, right? So that's also open source. These designs are picked up and then modified. And this is same in a software industry, right? 80 to 90% of your code is actually open source. You take it and you build on top of it. That's your secret sauce. What Tesla has done is, just taken the basics and added the secret sauce on top of it. So I would say the open source methodology extends to almost every industry. The culture is what we call as the inner source culture in adapting to the open source world in your enterprise. What the inner source culture says is, how do you start using the same methodologies of open source within the organization, which is about discoverability, which is about sharing, which is about contribution and collaboration. All of this can happen within the organization too. Because, if you're an organization of 50,000 people, there might be somebody working on some project which is great, but is not discovered or used by somebody else in another project, right? So how do you facilitate that discovery and collaboration is an important part of the question that you asked. And many organizations are actually using GitHub for that as well.
We have the question repeated from Chetan, how security issues are handled with such wide open platforms. And I think comment from Maneesh was you can always use the site lgtm.com.
Yeah, so there are two things. LGTM is one of our products which help you discover security vulnerabilities within open source code. At the same time, on GitHub itself, when you're developing software, all of the security points are integrated within the development lifecycle. So as you are developing code, it is scanning your code, it is helping you identify issues. So it's not only about discovering issues after the project is developed. Right from development itself, we are making sure that you're building secure software.
Thank you. We have a few questions from Shobit Agarwal. In the world of open source, applications are developed only through GitHub. There might be other companies like GitHub. I am from Microsoft background, so I am a bit conscious to move to open source world.
Sorry, you were breaking up. I didn't quite.
Oh, I'm sorry. In the world, all open source applications are developed only through GitHub. There might be other companies like GitHub. Shobit is from Microsoft background, so he says I'm a bit conscious to move to open source world.
Right. That's also an interesting one. So not every organization, wants to do what you just said, right? They don't want to be in the open. So what the platform also helps you do is a mix of both, right? So you have your private walled garden. I think of it like that, where you're using the same products, same technology, same methodologies for developing your private software, right? But you have sort of like a small path available to inherit a lot of the open source software as well. So you can always do a mix and match. And there are global banks, there are global software development companies, Microsoft is one of them, which use GitHub for achieving exactly that same thing. Because in today's world, if you're in software, there is absolutely no way you can be disconnected from the open source world. You might not want to contribute, but you are definitely consuming. And so if you're consuming, right, how do you make sure that the piece of open source software that you've consumed, your project takes care of the security points, takes care of all the dependencies. If somebody makes any feature fix, how does that flow into your project? Because as I mentioned earlier, the fact that you're using open source library, you're actually inheriting everything from the open source community as well. So the platform actually gives you that mix and match approach um, to stay private, but also leverage public as well.
I hope that answers Shobit. From Chetan Mathur, are independent project and program management professionals also contributing to GitHub platform and associated application development?
Oh, yes. Yes. So GitHub is not only used by software developers, it's used by a lot of project management people as well, because they are the ones who also help pull a lot of things together. You know, that project management dashboard that I showed is just one example of, how the whole project gets managed. There are also lots of third-party project management tools that get integrated with GitHub. And these project management experts are the ones who help manage the project end to end. So the answer is yes. Even beyond project manager, there are a lot of different roles, like somebody who's just doing documentation, who uses it. If I talk about GitHub as GitHub itself, for us, all of our departments, whether it is marketing, whether it is finance, HR, they all use GitHub. So you can actually think of GitHub as an open collaboration platform. So if you're sharing information, if you're collaborating on projects, it can be used by anybody. More recently, if you look at what's been going on over the last few months with COVID, you've had a lot of academic institutions, governments, and research institutions share a lot of data and documents related to the COVID research on GitHub. It's not necessarily core, but these are documents that are getting shared. So there are a lot of different use cases for different roles for GitHub.
Thank you, Manish. We have a question from Sunita Gupta. How are large enterprises using GitHub or other open sources as their internal development platform and not make it available for community at large? Is it a multi-tenant kind of software?
Great, good question, Sunita. So there are two answers. Yes, it is a multi-tenant SaaS application. So you can have your own private space within GitHub, which nobody has access to. So it has all the security built in, multi-factor authentication, audit controls, etc. Right. So a lot of enterprises use it that way. So the private area within GitHub is your area, and you can sort of collaborate with open source using secure channels. At the same time, many organizations are not comfortable doing that either. They don't want a multi-tenant architecture, so they want something that they control. So there are ways of deploying GitHub for enterprises where they can deploy it on premise, or they can deploy it in their own data center. Right? So this is their own private GitHub, which their teams use. And as I was mentioning, there is that small path available to the public GitHub where you can still pull a lot of the open source code securely. So you can always do that mix of match. And there are thousands of companies globally who are doing both. There are thousands who are doing their private project development on the cloud on github.com, which is the multi-tenant application. And there are thousands of customers who've deployed GitHub in their private virtual environments or their on-premise environments and connected it back to the github.com version. So both are possible. Good question, because software code is IP, right? So all organizations are very clear about how they want to use
it. Thank you. We have a question from Vinendra. Are student communities, universities involved in as well?
Oh, I love that question. 100%. So for GitHub, students and academia are super special. The way I look at it, actually, I would love to have more students participate and contribute to open source, because, that's a real live project. So when you think about internships, when you think about really working on customer projects, there's nothing better than going through and working on an open source project, because that piece of project, that piece of code is actually used by enterprises, whether it is a Kubernetes container, whether it is, just a OAuth login module, it's being used by enterprises. So there's no better way of learning than participating in an open source project in academia. Apart from that, we have specific programs for universities and colleges called GitHub Education. Avindra, I would implore you to go to education.github.com. There are lots of stuff that we've made available to teachers, advisors, as well as students, which really help them to learn a lot of these methodologies, tools, and technologies as part of their own learning as well. So passionately, yes.
One last question. So this one is came from Amrit Lal. Sir, I would like to start a project on two-wheeler customization. These questions are related to app. Is it possible to get GitHub support for the same?
Sure. So as you heard over the last 1 hour, we are the platform that enables all of this, right? We support the community. We don't get into specific projects, but if you start, building your project online, I would love to share it with the community as well and help you invite more developers or contributors to work on it.
Thank you, sir. I think that brings us to end of the seminar.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for giving the time over a weekend. I hope the last 1 hour was useful. And thanks for joining. It was great for me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rakesh, Sunita, Nilima.
Thanks,
everybody.
It was great. Love listening to IT technologies.
Thank you.